The Hunchback of Notre Dame is a 2-hour nightmare. It's murderous, hideous, and repulsive. Mr. Chaney's performance as a performance entitles him to starring honors. Produced as it is, The Hunchback of Notre Dame may become a detriment to the box office it plays for. No, this is not my opinion, but that of the industry trade journal Variety in its review of this 1923 film. Hello, I am Michael F. Blake, and it's my privilege to be providing audio commentary for this film. I've got a lot of great stories to tell you about the making of this film, so why don't we get started? It's interesting to see how Variety reviewed this film, giving it really a negative review, but actually it turned out to be Universal's biggest box office hit of the 20s, and was a huge, really brought up Universal from being a mediocre studio, a minor playing studio in the Hollywood field, to a major player. This and Chaney's Phantom of the Opera were certainly two of their most important films from the silent era. Now, while this may be considered Lon Chaney's starring vehicle, there's another star of the movie that we're about to see here, and that is the set that was built on the back lot at Universal of Notre Dame. Now, right here you're seeing the master shot of the church. Now, if you look just above the doors of the church where you see the row of statues, that was all what we call a hanging miniature. Now, hanging miniature was, they actually built a little miniature of the upper portion of the church, and they would move the camera back to a certain placement and line it up to fit on top of the actual set, in front of the actual set with the camera, so that you could see, and it blended right in. It was a phenomenal piece of work for its time. It's, of course, something today you'd simply just do it with a computer. But back then, this was quite a thing. The set for Notre Dame, now here again, let me just deviate for a second. You see just where all the statues are just above the doors, all that portion above that was a hanging miniature, and they would put that, line up the camera so you could just, it would actually blend in with the upper portion of the set. It's an amazing technological achievement for 1923. What was very interesting is at the time they made this movie and it was in pre-production, a lot of people didn't think you could make this movie in Hollywood because you didn't have the craftsmen or the ability to build such a set. But Hollywood proved them wrong, and this was really the beginning of the grand set building you would see in many movies to come throughout the Hollywood's golden age. The set comprised about 9 acres on Universal's back lot, and if you're a visitor to Universal Studios today, it would be about where the earthquake attraction is when you take the studio tour. That's about where the set was. The set stood for many years. The church was torn down about 1940, and then other elements of it remained throughout until a fire on the back lot in 1967 destroyed everything. Now, of course, we're coming to the introduction of Lon Chaney. As you see here, the title card gives an introduction to the character. And here now you have a portion. This is actually a split set. This is actually a hanging miniature, and part of the actual set. Now, this portion of the set was actually built, where you'll see Chaney on here, was built on a hill at Universal, so they could put the camera down slightly lower and shoot up to give the sense of height. And in that way, if anybody fell down, such as Chaney, he certainly wouldn't hurt himself. It'd only be like a 5-foot fall, so he certainly wouldn't really bang up his body badly. Now, when Chaney went ahead and did this role, he followed the description by Victor Hugo very, very carefully. And you'll notice in this shot here, he has hair on his hands, on the back of his hands here. And if you look later on in the film, he does away with that. Possibly that Chaney might have felt it was a little too much after a while, and he didn't really need it. A little bit later, I'll get into a discussion of exactly how Lon created his makeup, but suffice to say that Chaney followed the description to Victor Hugo's character exactly. And matter of fact, he found a early copy of Hunchback of Notre Dame that actually had some drawings in it by Victor Hugo of what Hugo thought the Hunchback character looked like. And if you see that and compare it to Chaney's makeup, the resemblance is virtually complete. It certainly is exactly what Victor Hugo envisioned. Now, this high-angle shot you're seeing here actually was shot from the church set. Just above the church doors, they built a 100-foot high tower where they could put the camera up there and shoot down to give the sense of height. And now here you're going to see the introduction of Tully Marshall. Tully Marshall was quite an interesting actor, an interesting character actor from the 20s. And worked all the way up until the early 40s. He was born in Nevada City, California in 1864 and started on the stage in 1883 and played all sorts of, touring towns and road companies before going to Broadway, and eventually came back to Hollywood and it started appearing in films in 1914. Originally, he began to study law until he took an acting class in college and then began appearing in stage. His filmography lists 195 credits from silent to sound pictures, and he worked right up until the year of his death in 1943. And here we have Ernest Torrance, who's playing Clopin. Torrance was a heck of a character actor who was always playing villains, or mostly villains, in many, many films. He's probably best known for being the adversary to Richard Barthelmess in Tolerable David in 1921, and Captain Hook in Peter Pan in 1924, not to mention Buster Keaton's exasperated father in Steamboat Bill Jr. Sound films did not hold this actor, like so many actors from the silent era, back. He actually had a very strong voice. He had a Scottish voice, to be quite exact, but he was also an accomplished pianist and opera baritone, and he actually appeared in numerous operas for many years before vocal problems forced him to give up singing and he turned to acting. He died in 1933 after complications from a gallbladder surgery at the age of 54, but he was a heck of a great villain, and as you'll see, he certainly gives strength to the role of Clopin. It would have really been interesting is in 1930 at one point, he was announced to appear in a film with Chaney at MGM called Brother Officers. Would have been very interesting to see the two of them together. Now, the priest is played by Nigel Del Brewer, who played a lot of these kind of saintly roles. Probably the best one he's known for is the Christ-like character in Valentino's Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. The film is littered with tremendous character actors from the silent era, including now we're going to see Brandon Hearst, although I have to say Brandon Hearst's performance is a little hammy in this film. He really needed a stronger director to kind of tone down the melodramatic posing and leering he does sometimes. But as film went on and as he went on in his career, and certainly in the sound era, his acting was a lot more refined and certainly a lot better. He appears in Oxbow Incident as one of the men in the saloon and has a memorable little performance. Now, contrary to popular belief, Chaney did not do all his own stunts, although in this sequence here, he does a lot of it. Chaney was doubled in various sections of the film by Harvey Perry and Joe Bonamo. Harvey Perry was a friend of mine who I knew growing up as a boy, and Harvey was literally like one of the dean of the stuntmen of the silent era. Harvey began in the silent era and worked all the way up until the early 80s. He was one of Jimmy Cagney's steady stunt doubles. And Harvey said that on this movie, Lon actually made him up and put a wig on him and made his face up just in case the camera might have caught a glimpse of him. He would have been made up as Quasimodo. Primarily, he did doubling Lon in scenes such as like this one right here you see in this wide shot. But right there, that's Chaney. But Harvey doubled Lon in a lot of the climbing scenes, something he also did for Harold Lloyd in Safety Last. But you see here, these sets were just magnificent for the time, and built in sections, they allowed the director to use various areas without worrying about the actors hurting themselves. These sets that were on the hill, which the hill no longer stands there. It was torn down carved out in the 1960s to make way for the studio tour, was actually quite close to the old Phantom of the Opera stage, which still stands today on Universal's lot. That's stage 28. And you'll see here with Lon climbing down, and you watch the way he just moves, and it's just amazing to watch Chaney move with all this. You have to remember, he's got one eye closed, so he only has one eye he can see out of, and he's carrying a 15 to 20 pound plaster hump on his back, and all that weight on him, and the clothing, and look how easily he moves. It's just, every time I watch this sequence, I'm astonished, just how easily he moves. Now, certainly he made good use of this set and practice around it. And if you look here on our DVD for Hunchback, you'll see the little clip from the Hollywood newsreel where Lon shows a man around the set and climbs right up and shows him how easily it was done. And like any good artist, they make it look so easy, yet that you begin to think, gee, I could do that, and then you go and try and do it, and you suddenly realize how much work is involved in something like this. This here is, I think, a very interesting scene in how you see how Chaney kind of pulls back from Jean, because it's very obvious that Jean beats Quasimodo or intimidates Quasimodo, and he drags him along to things to do his dirty work. We are now introduced to Patsy Ruth Miller. Patsy was one of many actresses who were considered for the role for Esmeralda. Patsy began acting at the age of 16. She appeared opposite Rudolph Valentino in Camille, and she went on to star in several other films during the silent era, but she never really achieved major star status, and she retired in 1931. She was married married 3 times, once to screenwriter John Lee Mahan for 9 years. She was also married to director Tay Garnett, and wound up writing several scripts for radio shows back in the 30s and 40s. She wrote her own autobiography, My Hollywood, when both of us were young in 1988, and she was wonderful person to talk to about this film. She always used to say, I made all these other great movies, and I appeared in so many movies over these years, and the only movie people remember me for is The Hunchback. And for a long time, it kind of bothered her, she said. But she said, the fact that I'm remembered for one movie, it just is wonderful that, so many actors are forgotten. Now, we have this scene here. This was very typical in silent era films, to tell a backstory. Now, we see the medallion here. This medallion will play an essential part in the story as the movie goes along. And it was always a way of, you'll see that this crazy lady here, played by Gladys George, who often played such roles like this in silent films. And then there would be a character off to the side, like the 2 ladies, and one lady would say, oh, this poor woman, she used to be happy. And it'll go into this flashback sequence to quickly give a backstory of what happens to this character, to quickly explain this is what happened to her and why she has become the way she has become. Now, this was a standard ability in silent films to tell a story. Once, of course, sound films came in, that kind of was dropped, and you didn't have that as easily. It wasn't as a storytelling point they could do as often because, of course, of the spoken words. But with silent films, you were able to get away with it. It was an interesting way of getting, in a matter of a few minutes here, you see, you tell a whole backstory to a character's background. And here it is. Boom. You've got this character here, and you've seen within a matter of 2 or 3 minutes her whole backstory and why she's crazy. And this was a very good way of telling the story, both visually and in a narrative form. Now, Gladys Barackwell, she also, for those of you who are truly trivia-minded, she appeared with Chaney in Oliver Twist. She plays Nancy in Chaney's 1922 version of Oliver Twist. And she died fairly young because of a car accident. Now, here we have another shot of the plaza, and we go now into the night sequence. Now, most silent films back in the days were shot for a night sequence. They'd actually shoot it during the day, and then when the film went to the lab, they would tint it a blue, as you see it here, to give the sense of it being at night. Hunchback was one of the first films to actually shoot many of their night sequences right at night using a large amount of lights. One of the reasons most silent films shot during the day and then they would tint it at night for a night sequence was because the orthochromatic film stock, which was prevalent at the time, had such a slow exposure rate, they really needed a lot of light to pump it into to light up a set. Now here with the Festival of Fools, you see here's Cheney has been crowned as the king of the Festival of Fools. They do away with, unlike in the 1939 version where you see different faces come out until you see the Quasimodo character, they did away with that. This whole night sequence was shot on the back lot, and Tay Garnett once told an interesting story that when they were filming at night and there was always a delay in production, you know, something was wrong with the camera, then they'd be ready and then a light went out, and each time the extras would douse their torches and sit down and grumble at the long going filming at night, and then every time they were ready an assistant director would go, light your torches and pull up your tights. And Tay Garnett really liked that description. Matter of fact, he even used it for the title of his autobiography. Now this sequence here where we see, it will be the first time we see Esmeralda and Quasimodo together, where they actually meet. And Burt Lancaster and I were discussing one time Cheney's performances, and he said this sequence he remembered as watching it as a boy, and he said the sequence where Cheney comes in here and he sees her, and she looks at him and she's repulsed by his looks and gives this repulsive look and turns away from him. Lancaster said that Cheney expressed in a few gestures what pages of dialogue couldn't. Now, as we cut here momentarily to the sequence here with Tully Marshall, and we are now introduced to Norman Carey, you see here how the set actually plays a part in the story. Look at how vast it is, how cold, how isolated it is, which gives an idea of what the King of France was like. He was isolated from his people at the time. You know, he did not care for his people. So this whole set, just by seeing the set here, gives you an idea of what the character is like. Now, Norman Carey was quite an interesting character. He started out in films in the teens, and his real name was Arnold Kaiser. He entered movies around 1916 and co-starred with Mary Pickford in a few pictures, but his major break came with Erich von Stroheim's The Merry-Go-Round in 1923, which was made just before Hunchback came out. And of course, he appeared in Hunchback and Phantom, as well as being loaned out by Universal to MGM to appear with Cheney in The Unknown in 1927. By the early 30s, Carey had moved to the south of France and had appeared in a couple of films over in Europe, and he was living pretty much the high life in the south of France. But with the outbreak of World War II in 1939, he tried to enlist in the French army, but he couldn't do it unless he renounced his citizenship. So he didn't. He went into the French Foreign Legion instead and served a little bit of time before contracting pneumonia, and he was mustered out and returned back to the United States in the early 40s. Now here we have the sequence where Lon sees Patsy Ruth Miller, and you'll see here, watch how Patsy will snub his looks, and watch Cheney's reaction. That one gesture there, that one look, it just says everything to the character of Quasimodo. Now, an interesting story that goes along with the Hunchback. Most people believe that the idea to make the Hunchback of Notre Dame came from studio executive Irving Thalberg. And for many, many years, it was considered the legend. But in 1993, I was introduced to the family of Alfred Grasso, who happened to be Cheney's business manager from 1920 to 1924. And they invited me over to their house one day and said, I have some papers you might be interested in looking at. Well, all I could keep saying after seeing these papers was, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, because you were literally looking at papers that I realized was rewriting Hollywood history. And the truth of the matter is, it wasn't Thalberg's idea to make Hunchback. It was Cheney's. Cheney had the desire since 1920 to go ahead and make this movie. You know, I was speaking earlier about how sets can be a way of showing things as far as, or especially this set or these sets in this movie. And you look at, for instance, in this film, or this shot right here, you have the dichotomy of the rich and the poor. Here you have the rich with Phoebus and the young lady and the beautiful gown she wears and her beautiful room. She's got this ornate balcony. And then you see this little corner here of all these beggars and the gypsies and such. And you see the dichotomy that was prevalent at the time that is very obvious in Victor Hugo's novel. And another interesting thing is how in a lot of these sequences, there's only a small number of extras, like maybe 100, 150. And how they will make this area look very busy. They'll, for instance, like this shot here where you'll see Esmeralda dancing, they stick everybody over to a corner of the set and spread them out a little bit. Now, and it looks like there's a lot of people here when there really isn't. It's a very effective way of using a minimal amount of what you have to make it the most. It's something that Joseph Pevney had to do when he did Chaney's film biography, The Man of a Thousand Faces, in 1957. He had the same problem. He wanted several hundred people for extras, and his first day he only had 75, and his second day he got about 150 extras. So he really had to spread them out and strategically place them to give a sense of depth and of a lot of people around there. Again, look at this set here. Look at how the steps are worn down and have a slight wear to them from people going up and down them. Now, if you see actual churches in Europe of the time, including Notre Dame, these steps look just like that, that they've been worn down over the years. And here you see the blind beggar in front of the church, which the church back at that point was the greatest sense of sanctuary for the people. The sets on this film are just phenomenal. When you consider what they did for its time, it's just a terrific looking set, and it's certainly something that Universal got its money's worth. Because if you watch any film from this period on that Universal produced, there's always some film that's been shot on these sets over the years. It was really just a brilliant design and a brilliant way of constantly using the sets over and over, something which was terrific about the Hollywood golden era of the studios. Nothing went to waste, and they made the most of what they had. And really, if you look at this set, the plaza's not that big. I mean, granted the set takes over 9 acres, but if we could go back in time to 1923 and stand there in the middle of this set, it's not really that large as it looks like on screen. And that's because of the camera placement and the way the camera is used and where you put the camera, what the angle is, whether it's a high angle or a low angle or shooting from a certain area. But it's a very effective, the cameras are used very effectively. One thing is interesting here in this night shot that I thought was very interesting, and it's commentary about working on nights, is you'll notice in some of the shots here, you'll see vapor breath coming from the actors' mouths. One thing that has not changed in over 100 years of cinema is how hard it is to work at night on a film. You ask any crew member, and they'll tell you one of the hardest things to do is work nights. And Universal's backlot was notorious, and still is notorious, for always being cold at night. And in the winter months, it's miserably cold. The backlot area is kind of a horseshoe area, and there, at the time when this movie was made, there's a little creek bed running alongside. In LA, we call it the LA River, which shows you how people think in LA. We think it's a river, and it was really a little creek bed. But the dampness would just settle in down there. And I had spent many years at Universal as a makeup artist. It was my home lot when I started out in the business as a makeup artist, and we would work in the back lot. And it was notoriously cold. And even in the summer nights, it was notoriously cold. It would be at least a 20 to 30 degree difference from anywhere else in the valley. Patsy Ruth Miller told me that this sequence here was one of her first scenes she shot with Lon. And she said that when they rehearsed the scene and Lon comes out and grabs her, she says, this thing comes out of the dark, and he goes, "Arr!" at her. And she says, you could hear me screaming all the way to Hollywood, which I always thought it was rather a delightful little story of hers. She had such great memories of this film, and she was, like so many people from this period, they were great storytellers, and they just their eyes would light up. They would act out the story. It was just wonderful to get Patsy talking about this, and she became very animated, and it was just something you don't see today with a lot of actors. Is the actors of this period and of the Hollywood's golden age, they could tell great stories, and they could get really into talking about, if you get them talking about what was it like to work on this film and that. And they would literally begin performing for you of what it was like. Now you see here, this is where Phoebus and Esmeralda now meet. And of course, for Phoebus, this is just another pretty face, but Esmeralda has found her Prince Charming. And as we will see in the upcoming scene here, he attempts to woo her. A lot of wranglers were put to work on this film. Almost all these guys that were riding the horses were old cowboys, and they got a lot of work on this film, playing the horse guards and that. Now, this is another major set of the movie, was the Court of Miracles, and this is a wonderful way of introducing it. Of course, with the title card. And you notice on each title card here, there's a different type of artwork, sometimes maybe to introduce a character or that. But you see here you have this lame person hobbling in. And you notice the depth of field they attempt to give you with a very small set, really, by putting the camera back, creating certain shadows. And you get a sense of depth just by the lighting. That if they shot this during the day, it wouldn't be as effective as it is at night. And one thing you'll notice in a lot of these wide-angle shots to introduce a set or that, you'll have people in the foreground and then people in the background there, which is they'll be right by the camera in the foreground to give it a sense of depth. Like you have the people here on the corner of the right-hand screen, and it kind of gives a sense of depth. And it was something you saw a lot of in a lot of silent films of the period. And again, it was the filmmakers trying to make the most of what they had. To give it, because really this set was very small, but you wouldn't know that by the way the camera is placed and the way it is lit and the way the people are there. And again, it's making a strong use of the amount of extras, the small amount of extras they have. Certainly a lot of great characters in this film of the extras and the faces they had. Some great characters. Now notice here, see the little artwork in the corner of the two people at the inn. Again, to kind of, this was very typical in the early days of the silent era. By the late 20s, you didn't see it as much in most films. It was primarily just straight titles and minimal artwork at best. Cary was a limited actor, to be kind. He really didn't have a tremendous presence as far as a strong acting appearance, but he certainly was, for the period, very handsome, and with his wax mustache was something he used a lot. What I find interesting is he went in and he joined the Foreign Legion, and what's kind of, you talk about life imitating art, in 1928 he starred in a movie called The Foreign Legion, and it's a lost film made at Universal, and then he winds up going into the actual Legion for a while there. Now, what's interesting in this sequence here, you'll see there's a couple of things that are used in the silent era to get across to the audience. Certainly part of it is because of censorship. They couldn't do certain things, or they had to do certain things because the censors demanded them. So they would do certain gestures or shots to convey something to the audience, as well as a character making a change. Now, for instance, here you have the spider in the web coming to this little fly here. Well, this is an allegory to Phoebus wooing Esmeralda. And you'll see here, he will make a gesture where he attempts to peel off one of her clothing off one of her shoulders. And this was very typical of a gesture in the silent era. They would use something like this to show a guy trying to seduce a girl without being too obvious, being blatantly obvious. I mean, today they'd probably wind up taking their clothes off. But back then, because of the censors, they demanded certain things, and filmmakers were restricted by certain ways, so they would do this. And you will also see that as she relates this story to him, that he suddenly has a change of heart. He suddenly realizes he cannot seduce her, and Phoebus becomes really kind of a gallant soldier all of a sudden. He's no longer the ladies' man as he is right here. You see, he moves the hair, and then he does. Now, in this sequence, when they were filming it, Patsy Ruth Miller said Lon was very serious when he was working, but he had a very phased sense of humor. And they were shooting this scene, and she says, I was looking at Norman Carey, and I was all cow-eyed. And she said, behind the camera, I heard this voice, and it came from Lon, and she said, oh, Mr. Carey, are my eyes too big for pictures? And, of course, it broke up the whole set. Now, you see, now we see the medallion. And as I pointed out to you earlier when we saw the story about Crazy Goulda and the medallion, now you know who that little girl is. And now you will see that because of Esmeralda's comment here, Norman Carey's character realizes he cannot attempt to seduce her. And he will put the clothing back on her shoulder. Now this, again, like I said, was very typical of the silent era. They would have demanded censors would have demanded something like this, or that the hero would come in and soundly thrash the seducer character. So now Phoebus will not attempt to seduce her and becomes the gallant soldier and the gallant hero, which allows him later on in the film to reclaim Esmeralda's love. As I said, this film was originally Chaney's idea. He went back as far as 1920 attempting to get the story rights. And like a lot of actors in the early period of the silent era, in the late teens, early 20s, a lot of actors were looking to form their own companies or make their own films. And Chaney certainly was not alone in that. And he was attempting to get financing for this film. Part of the problem was that it was going to cost a lot of money to make this movie. And he had talked to Universal as early as 1921, and certainly Thalberg may have been involved in it at the time, and may have said, hey, yeah, this is a great idea. But for certainly at one point, Universal was thinking of it more of a starring vehicle for Priscilla Dean as Esmeralda, who at the time in the early 1920-21 was Universal's major female star. But Chaney and his business manager, Grasso, went around looking for independent financiers to help create the production. And a lot of deals fell through, and then combined with in 1922, you had a recession going on throughout the country, as well as a couple of scandals hitting Hollywood. It made it a lot of investors were very hesitant to put their money into making movies when a lot of church groups and such were beginning to clamor for Hollywood's head on a stick due to the sensation of the Arbuckle scandal and the William Desmond Taylor murder, which eventually culminated in the formation of William Hayes taking over to run an industry self-censor board, often called the Hayes Office. At one point, Universal and Chaney were talking about making the film in Berlin with a German director. But the deal again fell through, and Lon kept seeking independent financing for the film. At one point in April of 1922, Chelsea Pictures announced they were going to make The Hunchback of Notre Dame with Lon, and it was going to be directed by Alan Crosland and filmed possibly in Europe. But like all the other deals Lon was trying to do, it fell through. And eventually Lon returned to Universal, signed a deal on August 15th, 1922 to star in the film for a reported $2,000 a week. It's interesting to note here that unlike the failed proposals that Chaney was trying to draft as an independent production, he did not get any percentage of the picture's earnings. I've often speculated that it's possible that in order to see his project come to realization, Lon may have been forced to give up any hopes of obtaining a cut of the profits. But it could also explain why, when you see the opening credits and it says The Hunchback of Notre Dame with Lon Chaney prominently displayed, that may have been one of the concessions, although it is not in any of the contract for Chaney, which ironically is only 2 pages. Today you'd have an actor probably would have a 50-page contract, but back then it was merely only 2 pages signed by him and Thalberg. This is an interesting sequence here with Esmeralda where she comes to Gringor's rescue, in that it shows her compassion by saving Gringor, and it later sets up her coming to Quasimodo's aid on the pillory. In this film, Gringor is not so much a romantic character as he is in Hugo's novel, it being romantically linked to Esmeralda, and certainly not like you see it in the 1939 version where Edmund O'Brien plays him. But in this case, Raymond Hatton, who plays Gringor, serves more as a comic relief in a lot of the scenes. There's a brilliant scene coming up that I'll point out to you when we see it here, played between him and Norman Carey, and Hatton really, you see his comedic timing do quite well. Hatton was quite an interesting character actor who was around for years and years and years, and in the late 20s he appeared with Wallace Beery in a couple of films over at Paramount Studios, and Hatton later went on to become a sidekick in a lot of B westerns. And he was a very, very good character actor. Just one of those guys that you'd always see in films. You may not recognize his name, but you knew his face, and had a real weight to his performance. Gave a lot of depth, and even a minimal role he gave something to. Now here, Quasimodo is now being sentenced by a judge for the attempted abduction of Esmeralda. And we have the pillory scene. Now, in this sequence here, the whipping scene, you're going to see it's very minimal. And the reason being is it was demanded by censors. You know, they certainly didn't want you to see anything of a person being whipped. So it's really more left to the audience's imagination as far as what really happened. You get a hint of it, but nothing more. And if you also look at this and you look in the master shots, you'll see again how the placement of the extras is done very well with a minimal amount of extras, probably about, I'm guessing here they had about 100 extras. And they gather them around, and you see here in the background, and then they'll cut over here. Now, these are the same extras, and they're probably just moved around. But they make use of the depth of the set that way. Now, for you truly trivia Chaney fans out there, the gentleman who is playing the torturer, who's going to whip Chaney, the actor's name is Nick DeRees. Now, if that sounds familiar or if he looks familiar, you're right. He plays Joan Crawford's father in The Unknown in 1927. Now, for this sequence here, Chaney wore like a rubber suit, which allowed him to hide his hump and to give a animal-like look to the body with all this hair. Now, can you just imagine working out on the back lot at Universal in the open sun and wearing something like this? It must have just been amazingly miserable for Chaney. Now, you see Lon here on the wheel, and we see the whip. He stretches the whip out, and he makes the gesture, cut to the audience, and now cut to Chaney's reaction. You see, you get the point across. You don't even see him flail at Chaney. And this was done to appease the censors. Now, also notice here, you'll see in some sequences, in some of the buildings, you'll see extras standing in the windows. Again, it's a great placement of the extras and gives the set a sense of depth and life. And then there again, he makes a gesture and we fade out. This sequence coming up, I think, really demonstrates Chaney's pantomime performance as Quasimodo, as well as gives us a really good look of Chaney's makeup, which I'll give you a quick idea of how he did it. As I said earlier, whenever Chaney played a character based on literature, he always went right to the novel, and this role was certainly no different. As I said, he wore a 15 to 20 pound plaster hump on his back, and he had a leather harness designed that held the plaster hump on his back, and it also prevented him from standing up straight. This harness fitted around his waist like a belt and had straps over his shoulder, which he attached to the front part of the belt, thus keeping him in a hunched over position. Patsy Ruth Miller told me that during filming he had this special stool with arms on the side that he would allow him to rest between scenes. Now, for the distorted cheekbones, he did not use nose putty or plasto wax because that would not hold up because the face is so mobile. But instead, Lon relied on the old stage method of using cotton and collodion. What they would do is collodion was like a skin sealer, and he would paint first spirit gum, which is an adhesive, and then he would place a wad of cotton in the area, then cover it with collodion and build up the cheekbones to the desired way by putting another coat of collodion, then some cotton, painting over that cotton with some more collodion, and you would build up successive layers till you get the effective pieces to the cheekbone the way you wanted it, as you see right here. And this allowed Lon to use these cheekbone pieces several days in a row with minimal work. Now watch this sequence here. This is really one of my favorite scenes in the movie for Lon's performance, how she offers him the water, and he's hesitant, and he kind of looks at her because, he remembers last time he saw her, this is why he wound up, and how quickly he drinks. And of course, the priest comes out now to his aid. And now watch how he breathes a sigh of relief. Oh, the water is good. And he's so grateful to her. And notice the chest heaving. I mean, just little bits that he does here. Now, there's one part here. She takes the other side of his shirt and puts it on his back, and you'll watch him wince. It's a little piece of business right here. There you go. It makes the role come alive. It makes Quasimodo come alive. It's a little something that Chaney gives the role that really makes it realistic, and you believe it. Now, to cover his eye, Lon taped his eye shut and used nose putty around it. He put a little bit of nose putty on the tip of his nose, as well as putting cigar holder ends in the nose to distend the nostrils. Applied some fake hair over the eyebrows. Now watch how he says here to the priest, Chester, look, she gave me water. He touches his lips. And then he had a dentist in Hollywood make a set of teeth for him, both upper and lower, that were attached by a clock wire spring. So the bottom part would push down the lower part of his jaw, but allow him to move his mouth and speak and talk, so he really looked like he was able to speak. But it also deformed the lower part of his jaw. And then, of course, you had the wig, which completed it, and the various highlights and shadows on the face. It was a very effective makeup, and it took Chaney at least 3 to 4 hours a day to put the makeup on. And needless to say, because of the teeth that he had in his mouth, it made speaking very difficult. And Patsy Ruth Miller said he rarely would engage in conversation when he had those teeth in, unless he really had something, he needed to talk about. Otherwise, he just wouldn't talk very much. Now, again, you're going to see in this sequence here, you have the ball sequence. And it's another showing the dichotomy between the rich and the poor. And, here she's complaining about her dress. She can't go to the ball, and what they will do for her to try to transform her. Now, I spoke a little bit earlier about Irving Thalberg. I'd like to give you a little background on Thalberg, because he was an amazing person for in Hollywood history. Thalberg was born, and he had rheumatic fever and had a very bad heart as a child. Matter of fact, they said he probably wouldn't live past the age of 20. And for a couple of years, he was self-schooled by his mom at home because he couldn't go to school. And he became a big reader. He read everything he could get his hands on. And the rumor had it was that he read Hunchback of Notre Dame, which may or may not be true. Anyway, when he finally did, he was able to graduate high school, and he learned how to do shorthand and typing, and he eventually, his mother was became very good friends with Carl Laemmle's wife, and she talked to Mrs. Laemmle about possibly getting a job for her son, and Irving wound up getting a job as a secretary in the New York office at Universal. And he really applied himself and worked very hard. And Carl Laemmle saw him one day and realized how hard he worked, and he decided to go ahead and hire him as his own secretary. And Irving was very insightful for a young man in his 20 years of age with ideas and that. And he got a call one day from Laemmle and said, "We're going to California, meet me at the train station." And he went to California, came out to the studio, and stayed out here for a couple of months. And the studio was a revolving door when it came to having studio managers. It just a real mess. Nobody here really stayed very long as a studio head. And when Laemmle decided to go back to New York, he left Thalberg here, and he said, you're going to be in charge along with 3 other guys here, and I want you guys to operate as running production. Well, as soon as Laemmle left, these older men totally ignored young Thalberg and his ideas and blew him off. And finally, Thalberg played his ace card and went to Laemmle and said, "Look, they're not listening to me, and your studio's not being run right, and I think we can do this and this and this." And Laemmle backed the young boy, reassigned the other 3 guys, and at the age of 20, Irving Thalberg became charge of production at Universal Studios. And, of course, established a very strong reputation with Chaney. Chaney was one of his favorite actors. Samuel Marks, who worked with Thalberg at MGM and knew him in the early days at Universal in New York, said that he really respected Lon's work. And I think that is one of the reasons why Chaney and Thalberg did so well on this film, is because Thalberg, I think, realized that by using this film as a special production, they could really lift Universal out of being a B studio playing into the majors. So Thalberg was the one who came up to Laemmle and said, "Look, we need to do this movie, and I think we need to do it right." Matter of fact, Thalberg left Universal in February of 1923 while Hunchback was still in production. But before he left, he decided to up the ante as far as the movie goes with the budget, because Universal production people in New York were saying, "Well, come on, give us this movie. We got to get it out into the theaters." They were simply looking at it as just another piece of programming to fill the theater bill. They weren't looking in a forward-thinking manner of that, this movie could really be a big hit for us and could play the big theaters in New York and do roadshow engagements and things like that. And so Thalberg decided at the last moment, before he left, he told Worsley, "I want you to hire a bunch more extras and do some more crowd scenes, and let's really beef this up and beef that up." And subsequently, it drove the budget up. The budget on the film was about $1.25 million, which was pretty much unheard of at the time. Von Stroheim, of course, spent a lot of money on Blind Husbands and Foolish Wives, and his budgets were very high. But this was really one of the highest budgeted films, certainly the highest budgeted film for Universal at the time. And it forced Universal to realize they had to sell this as a special production. They just couldn't simply throw it out into the market as just one of their regular films. They were going to have to really market this as a major film. And it was a brilliant move by Thalberg. And in February of 23, Thalberg left Universal to work with Louis B. Mayer's production company. And matter of fact, Chaney, while he was still working on this film, signed a contract with Mayer's company to appear in a movie called The Span of Life. And needless to say, the movie never got made because by late 1923, Mayer's company was in negotiations with Marcus Lowe's company, Metro, to become part of a new studio they were forming called Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. So Thalberg and Mayer, of course, went over to MGM and created their own history there. And of course, Thalberg told Chaney they hired Chaney to star in MGM's first film, He Who Gets Slapped, and Thalberg told Lon that if the movie did good, he'd give him a long-term contract, which of course the movie did, and of course Chaney became one of MGM's major stars. Now here we have another sequence, as I was telling you, about the rich versus the poor, and it's a way of using the sets and the costumes also as and the reactions of the women, of course, and this whole sequence, they drawing the sabers, and it's the rich versus the poor, and also the title cards, quarrels with only one of you this time. And then, of course, we'll also have a little comedic relief, as you'll see in this sequence here. The costuming on this film was just amazing for its time. Not only just the variations of all this, French nobility wardrobe versus just the everyday person. It was quite a. You can see that the money for this movie was certainly up there on the screen compared to going into an actor or director's pocket. Now, while this scene, unfortunately, like a lot of scenes in this movie, are not well staged, except this sequence here. Of course, you have this character who's obviously very gay, although is not shown to be tremendously, he makes his effeminate gestures and walks off, and of course serves as comedic relief. But for the most part, this film is pretty stodgily directed by Wallace Worsley. Worsley was not was kind of an odd director's choice for this film. Originally, Chaney, who had a lot of say on this film, he originally was looking at a bunch of directors. Matter of fact, in an October 5th, 1922 telegram, Lon's business manager sent him this telegram saying that Thalberg wanted your opinion on such directors as Alan Holyabar, Chet Withy, Hobart Henley, and Emile Chateau. And Lon replied that he felt Holyabar would be as expensive as von Stroheim, which is interesting to see that they were even briefly considering von Stroheim for it. He also flatly ruled out Henley, but felt that Chet Withy and Chateau might be possibilities. Lon's strongest favorite director he really wanted for this production was Frank Borzage. He said, "I feel Borzage would do it nicely." Another director Lon was leaning heavily towards was Raoul Walsh. But Universal being Universal at the time, they were looking at more second-rate directors, and Lon was not happy with a lot of their choices, and things reached a boiling point where Lon noted to Grasso in an undated letter, he said, "Now about our dear friends, Mr. Universal. Al, I want to tell you right now that I positively refuse to do the picture with any of the directors they have there, and I want you to go over that contract very carefully and see if there is a possibility of getting out of it should they be unable to get a satisfactory director and cast when it comes time for me to start. I will break my contract if they don't. Now, I want you to be sure and tell Thalberg that and let me know what he has to say. I'm not going to stand for any of their foolishness or stalling. Now, remember that. Just simply stand pat and they will get busy." In another letter, which is also undated, Lon reiterated his stance on breaking his contract with Universal and felt he could take it, oddly enough, to Louis B. Mayer's production company and have Fred Niblo direct it. In that same letter, Chaney conceded that he felt Wallace Worsley was, quote, "as good as any of the second-raters or better, but for God's sake, don't tell them so." Well, ultimately, the decision was made by Thalberg and Universal, and they chose Wallace Worsley as the director. Now, Worsley, like many actors, had begun on the stage, started as an actor, entered films around 1917, and started directing a year later. His most well-known film up to this point was directing Chaney in The Penalty for Goldwyn. And he wound up directing Chaney in 3 other films for Goldwyn, Ace of Hearts, A Blind Bargain, and Voices of the City. And that may have been one of Thalberg's reasons for hiring Worsley as a director. After The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Worsley directed 3 more films, his last one being in 1928, and he just disappeared off the radar screen. He never really had anything of equal merit to The Hunchback. Oddly enough, his son, Wallace Worsley Jr., began as a script supervisor working on Wizard of Oz and moving up to being a production manager on such films as Deliverance, Earthquake, and E.T. He published his autobiography, From Oz to E.T., came out shortly after his death in 1991. Now, this sequence here, I was telling you earlier, is a wonderfully played sequence between Norman Carey, aside from this overacting here on his part, but this wonderfully comedic sequence here with Raymond Hatton, and it gives a little bit of light in the story here. And again, as I said before, it shows Gringo's character in this version of Hunchback of Notre Dame serves more as a comedic interlude, as well as really a kind of a sidekick to Phoebus from this point on in the movie, as you'll see. And certainly shows Hatton's comedic talents off very well. As funny as you would think Hatton would have maybe a light voice, not a very deep voice, but in sound films he had this very deep, resonant, hard-edged voice, which was really kind of interesting. It served him quite well as he went into westerns and played the sidekick. And you see here how he's looking at all this food and hasn't seen this kind of food in quite a while, and dips the bread, and of course Norman Carey will grab his arm, and there goes the bread. This is, as I said, for me, is one of the high points of the film, I think. It's a really well-played little sequence here. And the director was wise to leave the camera here and just let the 2 actors play in front of it rather than trying to break it up. And of course, anytime this film is shown, that sequence always gets a big laugh in the theaters. Now you'll see in this scene here, Jehan enters, and again, it's pretty melodramatic and pretty stagey, which I think really hurts the film. There's a lot of sequences in this film where some of the actors' performances, including Chaney, it has a couple of scenes where they're a little too hammy, they're a little too stagey, and I think it really hurts the overall tone of the film. And in the eyes of, now here you see he comes in with a cape up like that. I mean, that's pure 19th century melodrama, and early 20th century melodrama stage work. And it just, in the eyes of viewers of today, we just laugh at it because it's just so ridiculous. And it is. It's sadly it is. It's just an unfortunate, poor choice by the director. As I was talking earlier about the wardrobe, there was one thing I wanted to mention here. One of the hardest things for a film of this scope and of this scale is costuming all these people, and especially as you'll see the sequences in the square where you have all these extras, and especially in the night sequences coming up here, you had almost 2,000 extras, and it's like, how do you get these people clothed in a specific amount of time and get them out on the set in time to shoot? Well, what they wound up doing is they hired a military officer who was a costume supervisor, and he solved the logistical problem by having a building constructed near the massive Notre Dame set. And it was about 120 feet long and had 18 windows, and each window was specifically numbered 1 through 18. Now, when an extra came to work for the day, he'd get his daily voucher, and on that voucher would be number 1, number 2, number 3, and so on. And that number would guide that extra to that specific window at the wardrobe building. And they would hand in their voucher, and they would know, okay, you're number so-and-so. And each window had a rack behind them of all the wardrobe with the people's names on it. And they would pick the wardrobe and say, okay, here you go. Now, another way to keep the extras on hand is they kept these extras on payroll, continual payroll, rather than having to recast and say they'd use the extras for 2 days and say, okay, well, you're not going to work for a couple of days. Well, these extras then may get a longer running job, and then they'd have to recast somebody and refit somebody. They didn't do that. The studio decided it was cheaper in the long run to keep these people on payroll, and then we've got them, and we don't have to change wardrobe. We don't have to worry that this costume won't fit somebody else. And both Chaney Worsley and the screenwriter, Pearlie Poore Sheehan, were all involved in approving the casting of the extras for the various scenes. And at one point, to handle all the numerous extras, they hired over 200 people just to handle the wardrobe duties alone. Now you see here the interior set of Notre Dame. This was actually built as well as part of the set from the front. What we would call this a practical set, so that, as you see now, the camera is looking out and you can see the square out beyond in the background. Well, this would be considered what we would call in studio parlance a practical set. That they just built a section of this area here so that they could move the cameras inside to get shots as well. And you'll see how they make use of the pillars and that to give a sense of depth and a sense of forced perspective. Because as Esmeralda walks in and they're shooting from behind her looking in, the set only goes back so far, and then it's a backdrop. And then, of course, by bringing the camera up, like you see in this shot that just was there, and we'll have it again, it gives another sense of height. And you have the pillars up front, so it gives it a sense of depth, when really the set was probably not that big at all. But by doing that, it's little tricks of the trade. Like, for instance, if you visit Disneyland and you're standing there at Town Square by where the flagpole is, and you're looking down and you see the castle, and the castle appears to be a little bit bigger than the buildings along Main Street. Well, that was specifically done. That's called forced perspective. They scaled down the second stories of the buildings to give the sense that the castle would be bigger. And that all comes from building movie sets. You have to use a sense of forced perspective to get certain things across, because you only had so many feet or so many yards to build a set in. And again here, you'll see Cary does a typical melodramatic pose, which again, it really hurts the film. One has to really speculate what kind of film we would have had Chaney been able to get somebody like Frank Borzage or Raoul Walsh to direct this film. What we would have gotten as far as direction goes. And of course, now you see the villain, and he sees the lovers together, and looking from above. And again, notice the way Brandon Hearst here is illuminated. You know, he's got the dark cloth, and the light is kind of shining up at his face. It really gives him an evil look to his character, like he's always lurking in the shadows. Now you see right there where you have the front there, where you have a little sarcophagus, that would have been the end of the set, and everything beyond the back of that would have been a backdrop. The rest of that is all a backdrop. But yet you get that sense of depth. Again, I just marvel at this set for 1922, 1923, what they did with the entire sets and how they were able to do something like this was just... It's truly a tribute to the Hollywood craftsmanship that they had back then, and really a tribute to all those great craftspeople that they used to build these sets. And speaking of the sets, they used over 450 crew members, which included carpenters, masons, prop men, and for you truly trivia-minded people, they used more than 2 acres of cement and 1 acre of cobblestones to pave the huge square and other streets to simulate 15th century France. It's really just a beautiful, beautiful set, and it breaks my heart that so many of these great sets have long since gone. And I'm always sad to see, even today, on some movies, when we have sets that are really spectacular, and they build them and tear them right down. that was the great thing about the old studio system, is these studios would build these sets, and they'd build them to last. They just simply didn't make it for that movie and blow it off. They built it, and because they knew, okay, we'll use it for this movie, but we'll also use it for another one. And studios were very economical back then. I mean, they would spend money on a set, but they also knew they could get the money for, they'd get their money's worth by building this set and knowing, okay, we'll use it again on this film, and we'll use it again on that film. Certainly that's the case of the Phantom of the Opera set, and certainly this set appeared in numerous Universal films through the 30s and early 40s. Patsy Ruth Miller told me an interesting story about Lon's approach on acting. She said that she said that in one of her emotional scenes, she was overdoing it a bit in rehearsal, and Lon came up to her very quietly and said, "Remember, my dear, you are an actress. You don't have to live the part, you just have to act it. The point is not for you to cry, but to make your audience cry. You have to be in control of yourself." Patsy also told me that Lon directed a lot of scenes as much as Mr. Worsley did. She said, "Mr. Worsley was a nice man, but I didn't care for him much as a director." She said Lon was on the set daily, even on his days off, occasionally making suggestions to Worsley regarding certain scenes, and she said they often discussed the script over lunch, yet she never recalled any friction between the two men. Certainly a movie of this scale, Worsley would have needed help, even as having what we would call a second unit director handling certain productions and that. You would need it just to handle the scale and directing certain scenes. And there's always been the speculation that the upcoming torture sequence with Patsy was directed by Lon, although Patsy said he did not direct it. But certainly I'm sure Chaney had a hand in a lot of this stuff. When it came to even with preparing the script, he had daily conferences with the writers, making sure that they got everything right. He certainly knew the novel backwards and forwards, and knew the film better probably than anybody else. Probably just as well as Victor Hugo, as far as the characterizations and their motivations and that. Now, this shot here, you see the big wide shot there. The upper portion of that set was what we would call a matte shot. When they would be filming it, they'd film a master shot, and the upper portion of the camera lens would be blacked out. And then later on, what they would do is a matte artist would paint in the arches, and they would superimpose them together. They would film it and then superimpose it, and that way they would have this matte shot. Now, originally, when this film was released, a lot of scenes were tinted. And for instance, like this sequence, the torture sequence in the torture chamber, was tinted in a garish green to kind of give the sense of horror and what was happening here. And again, you will see during this torture sequence, the way Patsy's character is tortured, it's very minimal that we see as an audience viewing it. And of course, this again was done due to a censorship code demanding that you could only you couldn't really show torture on the screen. You had to infer it, which in many ways I think was a lot. It allowed the audience to imagine how bad things were rather than graphically see it. And Universal had quite a lot of props for this film. They got, between the spears and the saddles and all sorts of material here, including the torture material. All this stuff was what we would call stock material that they kept in a warehouse on the studio lot, in the prop warehouse. And they would just simply call it up for the various films. And this was very true of all the studios in Hollywood. They all had their own prop warehouses, and sometimes if they didn't have quite enough, they would contact another studio and say, well, do you have any 15th century French lancers or things like that, and they would often rent from other studios sometimes. And it was a common practice. Back then, studios had all these sets and these beds and that. They would just simply, they would hang on to them because they would use them again and again and again. And it was very common to, if you were a real movie geek like myself, you could spot sets and go, oh, that set was used in such and such a film, or that set was used in this film. Or you might even the wardrobe would occasionally be changed. You as an actor may be wearing a piece of costume that belonged to another actor on a film, and the wardrobe department might slightly change it, whether it was a suit. They might, for when you had a three-piece suit, they might add a lapel on the vest where the original actor didn't have it, and things like that. But they had an enormous stockpile of material and that they could use over and over and over, and it wasn't just sets and props and wardrobe and rifles and sabers and all sorts of things. And of course, with the end of the studio system by the early 60s, a lot of them had major auctions and sold them off. Notably, MGM and 20th Century Fox sold an enormous amount of their material off, and were scattered to the winds. Either some prop rental houses bought some things, as well as movie fans did, and just held them. Would often use them to rent out. And then, of course, as time went on and materials started falling apart, they would just simply throw them away. And again, here you get an idea of the enormous work done on the set here with the sculptures. The masonry work here is just amazing, with the statues and the entrance to the church. And look here, like for instance, the woodwork on the door behind Ernest Torrance there. I mean, it's something you won't catch. You know, as a moviegoer, you don't really watch that. You're watching the actors, which is what you're supposed to do. But it's just amazing sometimes when you can sit back and look at some of these films, and you see the artwork and the set work and the design of it, and it's just amazing what they did back then. And sadly, we don't see this. Of course, these kind of films would be so outrageously budgeted in today's world of filmmaking that it's really kind of become obsolete to make a film like this. And unfortunately, in this shot right here, you're going to see this is one of Lon's overacting sequences. And there's only a couple of scenes in this film where Lon tends to overdo it, where you kind of wish the director would have pulled him aside and said, Lon, I really think you need to tone it down a little bit here. Don't overplay it too much. But for the most part, Chaney's performance is just outstanding, and certainly sets the tone. Interestingly enough, this was not the first version of Victor Hugo's novel to be made into a movie, as many people had thought. There was a 1905 version, was a 10-minute version called Esmeralda, which was made in France. And this version eventually became pirated in the United States and was released in 1910 by Vitagraph under the title The Hunchback. And then Selig took that same film, pirated it, and titled it Hugo the Hunchback. That same year, in 1910, Butcher Films of England released a version of the Hugo novel billed as The Loves of a Hunchback. The following year, 1911, Pathé released Notre Dame de Paris, while in 1913, a version featured tinted sequences, and that was called Notre Dame, and it was made by Pathé Play in England. Fox Pictures did their own version in 1916 called The Darling of Paris, which starred Theda Bara. Master Pictures of England made another version in 1922 called Esmeralda, and the German film company Helios did Hunchback and the Dancer in 1923, directed by F.W. Murnau. Now, of course, after Chaney's version, we have the RKO Pictures 1939 sound version with Charles Laughton, and in 1957, Anthony Quinn did a version over in Europe. as did Anthony Hopkins, appearing in a 1982 television special. And of course, Disney Pictures gave the Hunchback of Notre Dame story a animated version in 1996. And interestingly, they had in the Disney animated version, they had three gargoyles who kind of are Quasimodo's friends that talk to him. And in the original stages of the film, they were named Chaney, Lawton, and Quinn. But that was quickly discarded for more conventional character names. So it shows that Hunchback of Notre Dame has had quite a long history with Hollywood. And I wouldn't be surprised somewhere down the line we'll see another version of it over the years. Now, when they would be filming the large sequences with the extras in the square, this was the first movie to use the Western Electric public address system. Prior to that, for a director or assistant directors to shout orders, they had to use megaphones, sometimes very large megaphones set up on a platform, such as what Alan Dewan did for Robin Hood. But on this film, they realized they needed something better, so they used a public address system, which allowed Wallace Worsley to use this, and you could hear his voice all over the set, all over the square. And it was also instrumental for the lighting director to shout, to relay orders to his electricians and say, all right, move this light over here, you over here, do this, and move that light there, and things like that. Worsley had quite a handful of assistant directors on this film, especially with all the large number of extras, and one of them included future Academy Award-winning director William Wyler. Now, by using this public address system, they placed speakers all over the set, which allowed Worsley to communicate with everyone. And the lighting director, Harry D. Brown, said in an interview years later that during lunch they would place a radio near the microphone, and it would play music over the set and be played over the speakers, which allowed some entertainment and also kind of kept the extras from wandering away from the set. Now, this sequence here has is quite has an interesting story here relating to Joe Bonamo, the stuntman. Now, as you see, Quasimodo here, he's ringing the bell. He has no idea what he's doing it for, other than he's been told, go ahead and ring the bell, and he has this childlike enthusiasm for it. And you notice here in the artwork on the bottom there's a little image of Quasimodo with the bells on either side. And again, here's the wonderful use of the sets and the extras, being able to get a minimal amount of extras, but using the set and filling it up, giving a sense of depth and such. And of course, now we have the sequence where Gladys George will run out and yell at Esmeralda, and she will, of course, come to the horrible realization that this girl she has been cursing for a while is actually her own child. And you notice in her hand she has the medallion now. Now, the set in the background, that's about where the set ended through those arches. That was the extent of the depth of the set right there. But again, you by filling it up with extras strategically placed and also placing your camera in the right angle, you can make a lot out of it, out of a minimal amount. Now, this flashback sequence would have probably been tinted in something like an amber to help break up for the audience so they'd realize, oh, it's a flashback sequence. This was often done in films. she has this horrible realization that it's her daughter and there's nothing she can do. Now, both in the novel as well as in this film and numerous other versions, because this is a key component of the story, Esmeralda is taken first to the steps of Notre Dame where she is to do penance. And of course now Quasimodo, having rung the bell, decides to go out here. Now this portion of the set was one of the sets that was built up on the hill at Universal, and this shot here is looking down from the camera tower. And Notre Dame, and see, they also set up here about the workmen repairing the cathedral. And this obviously is done because in a little bit here in the film you will see why some of the material is there for Quasimodo to use when in the climax of the film. Now in this sequence they have a stuntman doubling Chaney who slides down the rope to rescue Esmeralda. And Worsley wanted the slide done in one continuous movement. He didn't want it done in fits and starts. So this one stunt guy said, "Oh, I can do it." And he didn't. He just grabbed a hold of the rope and he slid down and got severe burns in his hands, on his hands and his inner legs. And he also dropped halfway down. He was in really bad shape. So they brought in Joe Bonamo, who was a stuntman who Lon had worked with in New York on a movie called Light in the Dark. And Bonamo decided to do it, but at first what he did is he got heavy leather electrical gloves, and he sewed aluminum foil on the inside of them. And he also had aluminum foil sewn on the inside of the legs of the costume to protect his legs. So when he does this one continuous slide, he does it without burning his arms and his legs. And of course, now Quasimodo realizes that it's Esmeralda is the one who's going to die. He must do something. Now, this is an amazing shot here with Chaney where he just grabs the rope, and there's Bonamo doing the stunt. And you'll see it'll cut here, and then it'll cut to Lon being on the rope as it comes down. Patsy Ruth Miller told me it was a very difficult scene for Lon to, that he had all this material on his back and then to throw her over his shoulder and carry her like he did. Chaney was tremendously strong and in tremendous shape as a man. His grandson, Lon Ralph Chaney, told me one time that that Lon was so strong that he could literally grab a beam of wood and do one-arm pull-ups. He had tremendous upper body strength. And certainly for a role like this, as well as some other roles, he certainly needed it. Now, of course, you'll see how this is a sequence I think is very well played out, and is very well played by both Chaney and Patsy Ruth Miller. And has a lot of tenderness to it. And here he realizes, oh well, she's once again repulsed by my looks. But now Patsy realizes he saved her, and she reaches out to him. And like a faithful dog, he just sits at her side. It's really a very tender sequence, very well played by Chaney and Patsy. And of course, now we have Jan, who's realizing his plans have been thwarted. So now he'll come up with something else to seek Esmeralda's demise. Now, after this sequence here, there was a scene originally in the original Roadshow version, which was 12 reels, where Quasimodo takes a bunch of candles and goes and trades them for some clothing for Esmeralda. And when the film was released to the general public after the Roadshow versions in the major cities, the film was trimmed down from 12 to 10 reels. And you'll see here now, Patsy will see clothing laid out at her side. And these were the clothes that Quasimodo had gone to exchange. He went to a man with clothing. He trades these candles. And many of you may have seen this traditional portrait shot of Chaney leaning beside this trunk, which when it's open has all these candles in it, and he's placing some candles next to his chest. Well, that was part of the sequence. He takes these candles and gets the clothing. This, I think, is one of Lon's tremendous scenes, both as a physical actor as well as an emotional actor. When you realize this man's he can only see out of one eye at this point. Notice the vapor breath. So this was shot well at night, in the cold months in the backlot at Universal. And you notice how he captures Quasimodo's childlike glee. And he's just joyous that the girl is saved and he had a hand in it. And he jumps on this like his trusty steed, and he just rides it like the hero on his horse. And he's just like a little kid having a great time. And it's just amazing that Chaney can hang on to that and do something like that. Again, notice here on the title card with the images of the masses of the people. You have off to the right here a figure holding a saber up like it's Clopin, leading his people. And it gives you an idea of what was going on at the time. Kind of indicates something that's coming up for the audience. That was the great thing about title cards in the early part of the 20s with films. Some films had some very elaborate artwork behind the titles that would, along with the titles, would help convey to the audience what was being said or some sort of a description. And is of course a lost art now, but really was a tribute to the craftsmen of their time. Now, filming, I was telling you about how miserable it can be filming nights on the back lot at Universal, how cold it can be. Really one of the biggest problems for the filmmakers on this movie of this scale, aside from trying to clothe hundreds and hundreds of extras, was lighting these sets at night. As I said earlier, the orthochromatic film stock had an extremely slow exposure rate, so it required an enormous amount of light to illuminate a set. And especially when you were doing something at night, you really needed a lot of lights. And something especially as large as the Cathedral Square set, which covered an area measuring 600 by 900 feet, when they did the earlier sequence we saw of the Festival of Fools and this upcoming sequence here where they storm Notre Dame, they needed 305 various lights, from sunlight arcs to General Electric high-intensity spots to the practical carbon arc lights. And it was enormously not only expensive but intricate. The sequence that you're going to see now where Clopin now leads his people to Notre Dame, they wound up bringing in over 405 lights to light the square and the cathedral to the proper thing. And they employed 230 electricians, had 7 motor generators, and over 5 miles of cable. It's just an amazing and mind-boggling logistic. Now, in addition to all these lights for just this one film, Universal had 17 other films shooting on the lot at the same time. And that required additional manpower and additional equipment. Now, for the night sequences, how they would start out is trucks would depart from Universal late in the afternoon, and they would head to every studio and every rental facility in the Hollywood and Los Angeles area, and these various trucks would go to the various areas, and like they might go to Paramount, and they might go to Fox, and they might go to Goldwyn Studios, and they'd pick up these various lights, and they'd bring them back to Universal and drive up onto the back lot there, and they'd set them in the specific areas. Now, as the night filming went on, they would do it, and then as the sun started coming up over the hill, they would disassemble the lights, roll up the cables, put all the lights back on the trucks, and they'd drive them back to their various areas, and return the lights to Fox and to Metro and Paramount. And they would be used then that day during the day for their specific films. And then again, that late afternoon, the trucks would return from Universal, and they'd do it all over again. And this routine went on for nearly 2 months of work. It was just an amazing amount of work done on this with all the lights, and they had some on scaffolds, and there's a great photo in Patsy Ruth Miller's autobiography. It's a fold-out photo which accompanies the book. They have Wallace Worsley's script, and there's a fold-out photo that was done with one of these kind of panoramic cameras of the early days, and shows all these lights, and some of these lights are on the backs of open trucks or up on platforms, and it just gives you an amazing idea of what it was like to shoot the night sequences on the back lot. Earl Miller, who was the chief electrical engineer on the film, said in later years, he described working nights on the back lot as a combination of rain, fog, wind, and mud. He says days, weeks, months of it. He said those foggy, cold nights and the miles we walked night after night up and down on the cobblestone street, in and out of the mud. He said, I wondered how we were ever going to get that picture completed. It was really... working nights and on something like this was just a logistical and physical drain on everybody. To help boost the morale of the crew for these long nights of filming, they came up with a idea to publish a newspaper amongst themselves called the Hunchback Illuminator. And the newspaper was distributed amongst the crew to kind of lift morale and keep everybody's spirits up, and included a bunch of inside jokes and notes on the production. And often crew members will do things like nothing's really changed. Things like this still continue on to this day, sometimes on the call sheets, which is the daily sheet that's handed out to the cast and crew, which lists what they're going to shoot and what time the actors and the crew members come in and at. That'll often be something, maybe a joke or a quote that somebody said on the set. So a lot of things haven't changed over the years of filmmaking, although some things have, some things don't. Now we'll see the sequence here where Norman Carey, again, here's another wonderful shot, night shot of the hanging miniature. We're going to see a scene here where Norman Carey rides his horse into the castle, to the garrison, and the upper portion of that castle set was another matte shot. And here we have another shot, a couple of shots here, the crowd's beginning to storm. And of course making use of, now these were the nights where they had up to 2,000 extras on the set. And you can see where you really needed this amount of people to fill that square and to get that kind of depth of people filling up into the set. And just imagine the lighting that it took for these kind of sequences and setting them up. Very good scene here played between Patsy and Lon, where she's trying to convey what's happening. Now he realizes they're attempting to attack his beloved church, so he has to defend it. A lot of these sets, some of the Hunchback sets were used again in Phantom of the Opera. Notably, the front of the church was used in Phantom of the Opera at in the large chase sequence at the end of the film. You actually see the Phantom run by Notre Dame. And again, like I said, Universal certainly got their money's worth out of this set. And as I pointed out earlier in the sequence when Quasimodo was going to rescue Esmeralda from hanging, and we had the sequence with the workers there, that was obviously set up so you could see that the workers would be working on the cathedral, which allows us for this sequence now for Quasimodo to throw the various construction material down onto the people below. And it wasn't as prominent in the Victor Hugo novel about this as it was here on the film, that they felt they needed to get this across to the audience. I see that all that upper portion there of that set there was all a matte shot. Matte shots were used in the industry up until the mid-'80s with the advent of being able to use the computer. Matte shots have virtually become obsolete, and again, it's another lost craft in the Hollywood industry. We had some tremendous matte artists in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and they are all now a thing of the past. All that now would be done in a computer. There's certainly a large amount of cowboy wranglers here were put to work, and to handle all the riding and all the horsemanship on it. It could get and riding horses over cobblestone is very dangerous and it can be very problematic, because horses' hooves can easily, especially if they're shod, can easily slip on that cobblestone, as you'll see in a couple of shots here, and it could be rather dicey. But Universal at the time had their own set of wranglers, literally old cowboys from the Old West, who found as the American West closed, they found a new home in making westerns and appearing in westerns. And you had a lot of guys from that were unsung heroes that were on trail drives of the 1870s and 80s, cattle drives and stuff, that were now working in Hollywood, anything to do with a horse, whether it was a Western or, in this case, being a 15th century soldier of Paris. They would sit there and ride the horses. And out of these guys came some of your early great stuntmen, like Yakima Canutt, who did some tremendous stuff with horses, as well as Cliff Lyons, who later became John Ford's longtime stunt coordinator. For the film was commissioned with a original score for its release when it was released as a road show. Now, when I say road show, that was the old term that they would. The movie was sold as a big event. It wasn't just simply, we went and saw this movie for a couple of days. Road show engagements, especially back in the 20s, these films would be played in a major theater in a major city, like for instance in New York. This played at the Astor Theater and would play for weeks, if not months, or at the Egyptian Theater in Hollywood, or later such films would often play at the Egyptian Theater or Grauman's Chinese Theater for months on end. The bill didn't change on a weekly or daily or a couple of day basis. And the road show, it was sold. The movie was sold as a big film, and ticket prices were a little bit higher. Back in those days, it was maybe $1.50, $2. $2 was an exceptionally high price in the 20s for a movie. But that was movies that were charging that price were limited to the big spectacles, or the big epics that a studio would be releasing. And when they would play the major theaters of the major cities, and then the movie, maybe about 6-7 months later, would go into what we call general release. And generally, then sometimes the film would be trimmed down, such as Hunchback was, from 12 reels to 10 reels, so they could get additional showings throughout the day. But it was roadshow productions were quite common in the 20s and 30s and 40s, and they became less and less common by the mid to late 60s. Early 70s, you had a few films that were considered road shows, but by then they had pretty much run its course, and it was not really feasible for the studio. They weren't really making as much money that way. Now you see here the Wranglers come in to break up the crowd. And this can always, when you're doing a movie like this and you have this many extras, and you're also involving horses, and you've got lances and picks and all sticks and all sorts of things like that, accidents can happen, and most likely did happen on this film. A good director will partial out the area. Now, if we were doing this now, like this sequence here, if we were shooting this today, most of these people would all be stuntmen on the ground, and a wrangler or a stuntman on the horse, so that they could handle, and they'd know what the horse would do, and the stunt people would know what to do. Now you see here, they will actually pull the horse down. Now, by pulling, as you see, the rider there pulled the horse's head to one side. This was a way of getting the horse to go down. Cliff Lyons later perfected this, as did another stuntman, Chuck Roberson, in the early 50s, where they could be riding their horse at a full gallop, and let's say the person got shot or the horse gets shot, they would yank the horse's head to one side and they'd do what we call a horse fall, and the horse would actually fall from a full gallop onto soft ground and such. But it was not quite common at this point. At this point, horses were not well treated in films, and a lot of horses in a lot of films, notably the silent version of Ben-Hur, got killed. They were just expendable, sad to say. But by the 30s, the American Humane Association had a bigger hand in the overseeing of films and protecting of animals, and especially horses. Now this is part of the story here where Jean grabs Esmeralda and takes her off. This deviates from the original Victor Hugo novel. From this point on, this is pure Hollywood scripting and not following Hugo's novel. But filmmaking required, of the 1920s, required this. You couldn't really you needed something here where you know, this is the typical thing of the heroine being molested by the villain, and of course here now Clopin is dying. But filmmaking edicts of the 20s requires that you have the heroine being threatened by the villain, and she must be rescued. And interestingly, she's rescued by not Norman Carey, but by Lon Chaney, which is kind of a little twist on the hero coming to her aid. But in this case, I think works with the story and really sets up the story. And of course, totally wins audience sympathy for Chaney's Quasimodo. Lon's performance in this film is really an amazing piece. He certainly could relate to this in the sense of how Quasimodo is shut out from society because he is deaf, because his parents were deaf. He certainly could relate to the character in that way, I'm sure, and he's able to build upon that. And of course, now the man whose orders he blindly followed and who often imitated him, he's now totally against the man because he's harming the one thing he loves. And of course, you see, notice here how Chaney stands erect. which I've often speculated in situations like this, Cheney probably didn't have the straps around him that would force him into the hunch down position, because it would have been very hard for him otherwise to grab Brandon Hearst and move around the set and move him around in an easy manner. Although you'll see now he starts to try to, occasionally he'll try to hunch down a little bit as he pulls Hearst. And this sequence here, I'm always amazed at, given the sense of the censors, that you actually see him get stabbed once, and now you'll get a shot here where the knife actually goes into his back. I'm always amazed that they allowed that. The censors allowed something like that from that time. And of course, the villain must be dispatched, and rightly so. In the early 70s, PBS had a series called The Silent Years, and Orson Welles introduced the various films, and one of the films he introduced was Cheney's Hunchback of Notre Dame. And he said something about Lon's performance, which I think I'd like to share here, because I think it really hits the nail on the head about Lon's work. In Hunchback of Notre Dame, he was not merely horrific, he was exactly what the Hunchback ought to be. Exactly what he was in the Victor Hugo novel, a sort of human gargoyle who looked as though he climbed down the front of the Notre Dame Cathedral. And with all that makeup glued onto him and limping under that hump, there's still a performance. It's not simply somebody running around in a disguise. It's a huge performance, entirely satisfactory in its own terms. And of course, totally dims the rest of the picture, which is full of second-rate Griffith or C.B. de Millinery, which dates rather quickly, but not this performance of Cheney. When Cheney went to New York for the premiere, he made a very rare personal appearance, going to a movie premiere. Cheney cared not to go to those things. And he went to New York, and at the premiere, which benefited the American Legion Mountain Camp, which is one of the reasons why Lon went, his performance was widely praised by numerous people and numerous reviews. His performance was voted one of the best picks by Photoplay, and the film was chosen as one of the year's best pictures by New York Times, Film Daily, Motion Picture News, Harrison Reports, Exhibitors Trade Review, Motion Picture World, Film Fund, Life, and the New York Evening World. So it was quite an enormous hit for Universal. There's never been an official tally of what the box office was. The film was released all the way up into re-released several times, including 1928, 1929, and is still being shown all over the country and all over the world at various revival theaters over periods of time. So it really kind of shows and speaks well of the film, even despite some of its flaws, due to the fact that it still draws audiences in. This has always been one of the scenes in the film that I've always loved, because, again, you watch Lon's performance here, watch his pantomime and his body movement and listening to his bells, and then he passes away. You know, when Cheney started this film, he was viewed as one of Hollywood's leading character actors. Certainly was one of Hollywood's leading character actors. But with the release of this movie, Lon Chaney became Hollywood's first character star. And he certainly launched him on a tremendous career. Well, it has been my privilege to share with you some of these stories, and I hope you've enjoyed it. And I thank you very much for your time.